But to Martin's statement, 4 out of 5 from Palmetto is going to be tough. You know what I mean? It just is, especially because they're all, for all intents and purposes, uncommitted currently. Like, I know Savion Collins technically is on the list for Miami, but, you know, we've heard so much about, you know, he wants to go to Florida. He's just waiting to have his mom actually go up there physically because, you know, they are obviously doing virtual visits because of COVID and everything. But for all intents and purposes, he's uncommitted. So that means you'd have to, between now and signing day, lock down 4 of 5 guys. That's tough. It's potentially possible, like just on in terms of like, you know, the math of it. To be more of a realist, I'm going to say that the over-under should be like 1.5. You know, and if you go over the 1.5, so even if you get 2, again, that's a win. And if you go way over to get 3, if you go super duper ridiculous over and get 4 of those, great. But expecting at this point to get 4 of those 5 players, again, Corey Collier, Jason Marshall, Leonard Taylor, Savion Collins, and Brashard Smith, expecting to get 4 of those 5, I think is maybe a bit too optimistic for me. No, Malik Simmons. Gregory Rousseau was not a 5-star prospect. Gregory Rousseau was a 3-star prospect as an athlete who played wide receiver and safety mainly in high school at Champagnat. Yeah, that Gregory Rousseau. What, the one who's a first-round draft pick, probably a defensive end, the one who had 4 sacks alone by himself at Florida State, the one who's second all-time in sacks in the season for the University of Miami. He played wide receiver and safety in high school. Yes. And it was a big point of contention then because regardless of where he played in high school, everybody knew he was going to play defensive end. That was the thing that Miami was recruiting him as, or to play, all these kind of things. And it was like, yeah, you know, we'll see. But I'm like, bro, he is and even if you want to look at him as a quote unquote positionless athlete, that ATH category, there's no way that guy should have been a 3-star. None. 0. But people are like, oh, we can't see it or blah, blah, blah. And he's 6'6", 207, whatever it was. I said it then. Other people wrote it. Many people who watched those games said it didn't matter where you put him. If you wanted to have a jumbo-sized wide receiver, cool. If you want to have the biggest safety ever in the history of life, awesome. If you want to put his hand in the dirt, put him at defensive end, we can do that. Many people, coaches, analysts, writers, all kinds of people saw him as a blue-chip prospect, but when the math worked out, Gregory Rousseau was a 3-star athlete prospect who did not play defensive end until he got to college. Wrap your head around that one. 5-team pod with 4 teams playing home and home for a total of 8 games. You know what I mean? Instead of splitting. So you would have 3 pods in the ACC because, again, you got to count Notre Dame. Anyways, the foundation of all 3 pod proposals that I saw, and again, it's one of the Joes. I forget if it's Giglio or Ovies from the Carolina area. There's 2 of them. One does radio, one does writing and radio. I forget, but you can look it up. I saw it. It was in the North Carolina area. I think it was Joe Giglio, Giglio, who reported that. The foundation of each of the 3 pods for Miami would be Miami, Florida State, and Georgia Tech as 3 of the 5 teams in the pod. And then the other 2 teams would be interchangeable, or those were the teams that changed based upon the whole, you know, system. So one was like Duke and North Carolina. One was Wake Forest and Clemson. Another one was Clemson and NC State or something. You know what I mean? I think from a purely geographical standpoint, Miami, Georgia Tech, and Florida State would need to be in the same pod. And again, that's from the geographical consideration. And I know that the geographical is not the only determining factor for going conference only or things like that. But if you're going conference only, then you should, I think, have as the next step, the geography be part of your consideration, especially if you're talking about doing pods. So I think that those three teams going together works. Obviously, you're going to play Florida State every year anyway. So Miami and Florida State in the same pod. If you're going with multiple pods, you got to have that happen. With Georgia Tech, again, that's the next closest team. So fine, I'll put them in there. In terms of the other two teams, I'm not necessarily tied to any of them. I would personally prefer it if it were not Clemson, just because I still think that we're another mango season away from that. Especially if we got to the ACC championship game, that would be one thing, but a home and home, so we're playing them twice in the regular season. I think that that's a bridge too far for where we are as a program. So I would say that would be my personal hope. And I know people are going to probably say, oh, well, you want to be the best, you got to beat the best, you got to play them. I'm not saying don't play them. I would just like to play them in the ACC championship game and then not necessarily twice in the regular season if it were up to me. But yeah, in terms of the pods, I think that can be a good idea. I think that it definitely can work. But yeah, the foundation for Miami's pod, I think, should be Miami, Florida State, and Georgia Tech. And then you can kind of go with the other two teams from there. But obviously with the geography, especially of those other two teams, playing a role in the decision-making as well.
So we've done a number of call-in shows and live streams, and I've been asked all sorts of questions concerning scheduling all over the country. And of course, the Big Ten was the first to announce that it would not play non-conference games. The Pac-12 within the next day decided as well. And then there was speculation about the other three conferences. There's also speculation that the ACC and the SEC would work out a deal based on geography and based on the close rivalry situation. There's already 4 set rivals that are long-standing. Of course, we know what those are, and then they would expand on those and match up like a big weekend or a series of games throughout the season, matching up an ACC and SEC team that I think would be attractive. And if that would almost force the hand of the Big 12 to shut down non-conference play, just like the Big 10 and the Pac-12, because they'd have nobody to play. If the ACC and the SEC were only playing one non-conference game and it was against each other, and that would really, for me, highlight the SEC and the ACC in regards to just attention, because the one boring aspect of this season with all the oddities and wild card factors would be that if everybody closed down and just played a conference schedule, is we lose all those attractive, interesting matchups that are cross-sectional across the country, and we lock down to conference play, and we see these teams play every year. I have devised a system in which how I would schedule, but I kind of came up with 3 different paths that a conference could take. They could either look at least the perception of safety guidelines and so forth in regards to matching up the teams in terms of location proximity, and giving at least that perception that we're putting the kids first and the safety guidelines number 1. Number 2, they could go the route of, you know what, we're losing money anyway, let's recoup as much as possible and put out the most attractive matchups. So we're breaking out of our typical scheduling format, and let's say a Florida State Miami series home and home would be extremely attractive and lucrative. So let's get them on the field twice and like matchups across the board, and kind of leave the lower portions of these leagues and the less popular teams to play each other and match up Clemson and Notre Dame and Miami, Florida State as much as you can possibly match up those programs in particular. Or number 3, if they're thinking ahead to the college football playoff, how can we protect our best team, our Clemson, our Ohio State, our whoever who we think, and let's not expose them to an Ohio State to Penn State twice, or Clemson to Notre Dame twice, or Miami or whomever.
Right.
The thing I don't like about the pods, especially for the ACC, is there is a clear, unlike the rest of the country, there is not a second tier. I'm not talking about talent-wise, but in regards to play on the field for the past few seasons, going back to Florida State in 2016, they were the last top 10 other ACC team that won an Orange Bowl, finished in the top 10. So we've been void of a another tier below Clemson. And then so once you throw these pods together, Cam, you've got a poor 4 schools that have to play Clemson twice, and you're pretty much dictating that they're not playing in the conference championship game.
Yeah, I mean, and it depends on what you would do for seeding anyway. Because again, the proposals that I saw had 3 pods for the ACC. Last time I checked, only 2 teams playing a game. So if you're going to the championship game, then if you have a tiebreaker scenario, then like what are the determining factors? Are you going to have a play-in, a semifinal game to decide who's going to be getting to the conference championship game? If there is a tiebreaker situation, if there are things that are the same, things like that. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of moving parts and pieces, but again, I think that your 3 scenarios are viable. I think that the scenarios that I saw on the reported piece from Giglio are viable also, but there's just some fine-tuning details that need to get worked out.
If I'm running the show, I want to recoup money, and I want to bring attraction to the conference when there's going to be a fight for games on television. So I'm matching up the better teams, not knowing what the College Football Playoff Committee is going to do anyway. And especially in the case of Clemson, where they can probably still fight their way through and outclass everybody else.